Hello there. My name is Dr. Timothy Fong. I'm a professor of psychiatry. I am a co-director of the UCLA Gambling Studies Program, and I'm coming to you from my office in Los Angeles talking about perspectives on the impact of sports betting on mind, body, and brain. I'm delighted to be invited by the Evergreen Council to talk about some of our thoughts, opinions, and updates in regards to sports betting. I'm coming to you today, August 2022, with information about what we know about sports betting, but more importantly, things we don't know and things we need to be focusing on as we see the expansion of sports betting hitting America over the next several years. First, a slide on the financial disclosures I received for the support for studying gambling and developing more effective treatment for gambling disorders. Emphasizing here today, I have really three main areas I want to focus on. Number one, talk about how sports betting impacts people's mind, body, and brain. Talk about things that we ought to do that will help mitigate the damage and harm that could come from increased gambling disorder. I also have a prevention roadmap for anyone interested in figuring out how do we reduce sports betting harm for gambling addiction as well as other problematic gambling. It's summer 2022, and we've just come off several conferences talking about sports betting, the impact of expanding sports betting. I think it's really timely now as we head into 2023 and beyond to make sure we have a firm understanding of how sports betting impacts people and the harms we want to reduce from it. So first, let me just start off with a case. And we see a lot of patients here at UCLA. And this one particularly emphasizes, I think, some of the current issues related to sports betting and how it can impact treatment. So we'll start with the case. Case is Billy. Billy, in fall of 2021, came into treatment at UCLA. He's 21, and at the time, he was expected to graduate from college in this year, May of 2022. But he got an appointment in our UCLA treatment program for gambling by his mother calling saying, "I'm worried about my son gambling." She found the number for our clinic by Googling help for sports betting, was able to make it a telehealth appointment, and we made an intake session. Billy logged in via the Zoom, and we had an hour for intake session. And he said during that first hour, "I'm here because my mom's worried about my gambling, and I'm willing to talk to someone because it's not that hard for me to log on. It's not that disruptive for me to log on for an hour to talk to a therapist." And he says, "Well, I've always enjoyed watching sports. I played high school sports. I'm going to school on the East Coast where a lot of sports and watching sports is part of the culture. My mom lives in LA. My dad lives in Florida. I live on the East Coast. And I'm talking to you, Dr. Fong, who's there in California." And he says that during the pandemic, during college, during the isolation periods, a friend said to him, "Hey, Billy, here's a login to an online gambling website I have access to." Billy was well aware that it was illegal, unregulated, wasn't regulated through the state. And Billy was able to get the login and a password, and he was given immediately an account with $5,000 in casino credit or sports betting credit. It was 100% digital. There was no human connection. He didn't talk to anyone by phone. And Billy was well aware that when his $5,000 in opening credits were spent, he'd have to settle up by paying through PayPal or Venmo or some other online wallet. Within the first 3 months of doing this, gambling online through this unregulated site, he was betting on sports nearly every day, and he liked what it did. It was entertaining. He won some, he lost some, real no damage to his life. But then as he continued to gamble, damage started to happen. He started to run out of his first $5,000 in allotment. He paid that off. He had to ask mom and dad for money as he continued to gamble on this online site. Now, one would argue, well, why wouldn't he just not pay if he doesn't know who the vendor is or if they have no human connection? But Billy was worried that if he didn't pay up his gambling account, that there could be repercussions, that there might be some other unforeseen forces that come out and actually get him to pay the bills. So he's starting to get into it, starting to develop financial debt, starting to ask mom and dad, starting to create tension about it, and then all reaching ahead in December 2021. When Billy says to mom, hey, instead of a Christmas present, I just want money because I want to use it to gamble on college football bowl seasons, and so I can make my money back. And that's when mom got very worried. She didn't like the idea that Billy was trying to spend to make money. She didn't like the way he was preoccupied by it. He didn't like the way it was a shadowy gambling operation, so she was concerned. And that's how Billy landed into my office. So again, Billy, during the office visit, was saying again, I don't have a problem with depression or anxiety. I'm in good physical health. I have a high GPA. I'm graduating in May. I have a job in New York lined up for July. I have a lot of friends. So these are all good things. But he does say during that first hour, yeah, I do gamble more than I can afford. But everyone else in my friend circle is doing this and using the exact same illegal, unregulated website. And at least I don't do other things like my other friends do. And he described his other friends taking out payday loans, actively stealing and borrowing from friends and family to finance, lying to their family and friends at a much higher degree than what Billy was doing in regards to how much he was gambling. What was interesting about his mindset, which was different from a lot of other gamblers we work with, is that he wasn't gambling to escape depression or anxiety. He was gambling because he enjoyed the experience. He wanted more dopamine action, something interesting and exciting in his life. And he was gambling mainly to, quote, make more money, specifically to have money to spend on his life, almost seeing it like a job. He did like the competition where he could show off knowledge to his friends when his bets came in, or how much he knew about sports, how good of a sports handicapper he was. But he was also driven not so much about chasing losses, but by having a fear of missing out on, quote, he described as valued gambling bets. So if he saw a line and he said, that's a line that I would love to bet, and if he couldn't bet on it because he didn't have access or didn't have money, he had a tremendous amount of fear of missing out, which was distressing to him. So he wasn't gambling to take away depression, anxiety, or pain like a lot of our gamblers are. He was gambling to get more excitement, to get more money as a job almost again. And he viewed it as baked into his day, that gambling now was kind of like checking the news or checking his stocks or reading about what's happening on social media. He saw gambling almost as an automatic part of his day to say, what's out there right now that I can bet on. So why that's important is because during that first session with Billy, some of the things that we've learned over the last 30, 40 years in working with gamblers are different. Here's a man that we're working with where we don't actually meet with him in person. We're doing it through telehealth. Here's a very high functioning individual who's coming in, but who's starting to have signs and symptoms of gambling disorder, but isn't fully impaired like someone with a lot of severe symptoms. So we talked about the signs and symptoms of disorder. We talked about what we should do for a health style to stay healthy, sleep, exercise. We talked about repaying his parents. We talked about closing out the unregulated gambling accounts. And we set up a meeting to talk with mom. All this session one. And I highlight that because it's a little bit different than what you would do maybe with a lot of other gamblers in your first session. This was very much prescriptive in getting them to do a lot of actions and again, getting family involvement very early on. The good news is that even after that first session, he was able to have significant changes. So a few months later, he comes back, still on track to graduate, paying his debt off to mom. He still watches sport, but he can watch sports without gambling on the games. His fear of missing out on the lines was much, much less reduced. He saw that he was taking a break from using online gambling until he got his own money. And he really had this vision of saying, you know, I get it. I get that this could go and become much more problematic if I don't stop it right now. His mom's still worried that Billy will continue to gamble in the future. And Billy himself says, I probably will. But he says, right now, I'm not going to until, again, I have my own money and until I do it on a traditional regulated website. Some of the questions here that are raised for clinicians is, number one, his presentation is similar but also different than our gamblers that come in over the last 20 years. So how do we as providers approach that? Number two, what would happen to Billy if mom never reached out? if mom didn't Google help, what would have happened if you continued to gamble on that unregulated website for the next several months? How much more harm would have occurred? And in terms of treatment principles, do typical strategies work out? When I asked Billy in the beginning, would you consider going to 12-step Gamblers Anonymous? He said, no, I don't know if I am comfortable going there. So that was a tried and true principle of recovery that we would normally do that didn't work. What was different here was that Billy very much wanted to watch sports. And traditionally we would say, oh, if you are gambling on sports, you shouldn't watch sports. But for him, because so much of his social experience was driven by watching sport, we spent some time talking about how can you watch sports without gambling on it. So that's definitely a different treatment principle. So a few things about sports betting in 2022 that we have to think about and sharpen up is, number one, our language. So we have a lot of different language, and when we talk about sports gambling, we call it wagering or betting or gaming or sports entertainment. It's something we talk about every day in the news. You hear words like parlay and teaser thrown about. I think it's important for us as clinicians and problem gambling experts to be very, very clear in what we're talking about. Again, the difference between wagering, betting, and gambling may be an issue of semantics, but I think it's important for us to be consistent in our language. So I try and use predominantly gambling on sports or sports gambling, a person who gambles on sports. Again, when we think about all the laws that are passed, we hear terms like mobile sports betting laws or mobile sports wagering. Again, there are different ways of characterizing it, but ultimately it's still all a form of gambling. To give you an idea, I know this is mainly geared for folks in Oregon, but it's on the internet, so anyone can see this. I want to give people a sense of what's happening in California, where I work, in terms of sports gambling. Well, here you can see sports betting or sports gambling 2022. Right now, before our election in November 2022, we have regulated retail in-person gambling, but we have no in-person sports betting with the exception of horse racing. We have online regulated gambling, mainly through off-track betting and betting on horses, but no online regulated gambling for sports. Unregulated sports gambling and sports betting exists today, both in person via bookies and then now on online unregulated sites. And as an example, January 2022, out of a survey that was done by Forbes, showed that 12% of folks in New York bet weekly on sports. This is right when sports gambling became legalized in New York in 2022. So significant amount of the state doing that. Here in California, to give you a sense of what's happening, and you'll see this story probably replayed in a lot of other states that don't have sports gambling. So we have two propositions that are on the ballot for this fall. Prop 26, which would allow in-person sports betting and gambling at tribal casinos and horse racing tracks that would be confined to inside the actual brick and mortar casinos. Contrast that with Prop 27, which would allow sports gambling to occur on mobile devices, which would be anywhere throughout the state of California. And so you compare the two different ones, you see that would have a big difference in terms of availability and access. One is going to be brick and mortar only. The other one would be mobile sports gambling. So where it lands, it's going to be a very interesting story. And by the time you're watching this video, maybe some of these elections will have passed. But the question then is this, is when you expand sports betting or sports gambling, what does that do to people? What does it do to people who are vulnerable to gambling disorder? What does it do to folks who never gambled before? And that's what we want to kind of carry through. So our first question we want to ask is this, and you can ask this in almost any state, is that in any state that expands and legalizes sports gambling, does the rate of gambling addiction go up? Does it go down, or does it stay the same? That's an essential question, and there's no general consensus answer to that. We know that for some states, we do see rises in gambling addiction rates, but is that because of more attention paid to the issue, more money for prevention, more money for advertisements, or is it truly because we have more men and women developing this disorder? What we do know is that we know those who are vulnerable to develop gambling disorder, those who are under age 18, those who have untreated depression, anxiety, and substance use disorder, those who are coming from communities at risk that are already disproportionately impacted by gambling addiction. We know that those groups are going to be certainly more at risk to develop more problems. We also know that older adults who are also at higher risk for developing gambling disorder, 55 and older, will also be at risk. So the question really shouldn't be, will gambling disorder increase or decrease? Because we know it's going to have an impact. But what the question should be is, what can prevention, education, and responsible gambling practices do to keep the rate of gambling disorder down? In the state of California, we know about 4% of California either at risk to develop gambling disorder or already suffering from gambling disorder. So if we introduce more sports gambling, how do we ensure that that rate doesn't go up to 5% or 6%? That's where I think the critical nature question should be. Number two, when you think about expansion of sports gambling, how do you protect underage and vulnerable from accessing it? So an example, every single state I'm aware of that has expanded sports gambling, it's always been for 21 and up. But what are the actual enforcement policies, procedures, the technical capabilities to prevent younger age gamblers from getting on? The client I was working with, Billy, he was able to get on very easily in an unregulated gambling site without any protection or stopping. Mobile sports betting apps have some of these protections built in, but how do we ensure that people who are under the age of 21 don't get at it? How do we ensure that parents and teachers and those who are in athletics ensure that those vulnerable do not access and have free reign to that? How do we get those who have free access to digital currency, particularly, again, underage, to make sure they can't use digital currency on apps that they're, again, not supposed to? So part of the question really has to be this, is that for young people, specifically under the age of 21, why this is important is that we know that the longer you delay their first bet, the more that's going to reduce the chance of developing a gambling disorder. We also know that for young people who bet frequently, that's the risk factor that leads to increased gambling disorder. So the younger you are when you start and the more frequent you are gambling, these are the risk factors that we want to protect from. You can see why with a mobile sports betting app, that's going to be a little bit much more difficult than brick and mortar only. So we have to learn from other industries and other areas, how do we make sure we do that to prevent young people from accessing those apps? Next question about sports betting and sports gambling impact is what, again, will happen to public health in general. Public health being just health and wellness, the overall quality of life in the state. So the questions are going to be like, as you expand mobile sports or sports gambling, does that give you an overall cost to the state, or does it benefit the state in terms of tax revenue and reducing crime and things like that? These are the questions that we're just now beginning to look at in various states that have expanded. The question I would ask to many state legislators, how much should you invest into the state to ensure that the public health is protected, to minimize the harm of gambling and strengthen whatever benefits come from expanding sports and gambling? The question again, is this a movement or is this a moment? In other words, will the states have sports gambling for the next 10, 15, 20 years? Or are they going to change their mind in a few years and say, you know what, after a few years, we're not seeing the impact we'd like to see on public health? So think about some of the stories we're hearing about various states that have very large sums of money wagered monthly, hundreds of millions of dollars, even up to $1 billion per month wagered on a recreation, on a sports betting site. That doesn't mean that that's $1 billion coming into the state. That just means there's $1 billion wagered, and it's a much smaller amount that actually goes back to the state after all is said and done. So the question I really hope people would ask, and ask themselves first, is how does expansion of sports gambling and sports betting, what will it do to my local community, my state? What are the areas of public health I'm concerned about that could go hand in hand with having more gambling? So let me switch gears again. One of the areas of diagnostic consideration with sports bettors and sports gambling, and it starts with screening. So as anyone working in the field of gambling disorders, think about how do we screen effectively for gambling? Most commonly right now, we know that sports betting or betting on sports or gambling on sports is not traditionally mentioned in most of our problem gambling instruments. So I think it behooves us to think about asking specifically, because one of the things we're seeing now is some people say, well, I'm a sports bettor, I'm not a gambler. I identify as a sports bettor, I'm not a gambler like slots. Some would argue that sports betting is not a form of gambling. It's a different game altogether. I think that's why we need to take a step back and really emphasize much more in having those conversations with any of our clients to talk about what is your relationship with sports betting or sports gambling? How do you view sports? Do you ever spend money on sports with the hope of winning money? So those are the more open questions I think that are important to ask for screening. In the last 12 months, how has betting or gambling on sports impacted your life? Tell me about your interest in sports. What is your relationship with watching sports? And how do you feel, asking the client, how do you feel about all this news about sports betting and sports gambling? How does that fit into your entertainment dollar? All those open-ended questions, I think, are critical if we're working with clients, not just gambling clients, but any clients in general, mental health or substance use, to look at that. So a note here in the DSM-5, I think is really interesting. The DSM-5 gambling disorder criteria are very specific in that they don't go by distinction of forms of gambling. We don't chart gambling disorder, and then we don't name the type of gambling that they're doing specifically. We do that for tobacco use disorder, cocaine use disorder, cannabis use disorder. We don't do that for gambling. I'm encouraging more and more clinicians to do that, and although it's not listed in the DSM-5 and under coding, in our chart that'll help us give us a better sense of what kinds of gambling disorder clients we're seeing and to what forms of gambling they're having problems developing on that. So I've laid out here kind of how I do it in my charts. Maybe it's slots or poker or sports betting or online casinos, brick and mortar. I think those are the specificity I like to see. So some of our experience right now, what we're seeing since the start of the pandemic with patients coming into our treatment program at UCLA, very much what the stereotype would be of who is betting and gambling on sports. Predominantly men, educated, working, very much had a relationship with sports growing up, either playing or watching, very technologically savvy, a little bit though, resistant to GA, thinking that's not really me. I don't feel like I can connect to GA. Pretty supportive families, but families who oftentimes might be confused about what sports betting is and isn't. And interestingly enough, most of our folks who come in this age group are very psychologically minded. I think it speaks to the millennial generation and Generation Z talking about mental health a lot more. So they're more likely to be accepting of talking about therapy. Again, this is just our experience at UCLA. It may be different wherever you're at, but knowing that clinical experience is important for us to craft treatment responses, treatment care that works for them. So in an intake session for clinicians, when it comes to talking about sports betting, I get very specific. I have a whole section that's specifically unique to ask them about sports, just like I ask about slots or poker or betting on horses, exactly what they bet on, what types of bet, understanding where they get money to fund their gambling, what their goals are. All that gives us information that we can then use in therapy to help either correct the misinterpretations or correct the cognitive distortions about gambling or focus on what's driving the ongoing urge and craving. Very important to get that information intake. Here in California, to give you a sense of what we have to address sports gambling, we have a no-cost treatment program in California that has helpline services, outpatient, intensive outpatient, residential. We have group, all done by telehealth. We treat the gambler. We also treat affected individuals, family members. I think that's an important consideration. If the sports gambling client won't come in, we really need to be providing care for the family member who's concerned or questioning their behavior. To give you a sense of the kind of folks we see in California, right before the pandemic, this is statewide data, the most of our gamblers came in were reporting struggling with forms of gambling inside the casino, so brick and mortar casino, slots, table games, blackjack, poker inside the casino. Internet was number 2 on internet casinos. Lotteries number 3, and then number 4 was going to like home games for poker or illegal gambling dens. Sports betting and betting on sports was interestingly across all venues the 4th type of betting they were doing. So across all those 4 casinos, internet, going to family and friends' house, betting on sports was the 4th form of thing they were doing. So that gives us some information as we expand sports gambling in California. Will we expect that number to go up? So interesting data there. Profile of our sports bettors, though, were very different compared to non-sports bettors coming into treatment. They tended to be younger. They tended to be younger when their gambling addiction and gambling problems started. And they tended to be younger when they came in for intake. All the more reason, again, for us to really start thinking from an outreach perspective, how do we reach these folks? How do we reach this clientele who may not be looking at the exact same advertising or messaging as some of our other clients? How do we target specifically for them to hear those messages? So it's going to be things like more digital ads, more Google searches, more texting and chatting options so they can get information quicker, more working with the online vendors that they do gamble with to get that messaging properly out there. There's our website for if anyone wants more information on our California treatment program, where you can get some of our treatment workbooks and find some of our treatment resources there. But a few things I noticed about just working with men and women with gambling related to sports. And it starts with this, is that right now, we don't have easy access for treatment. This is where I pulled off an experience. If you just Google help for sports betting, what you'll get right now in California are a lot of the information about the election. You'll get how to gamble on sports. You may not get linkages to our gambling addiction treatment specialists. So if you're doing any education prevention work, we have to do better to make sure that when people Google this way, they actually get. Because if you think about help for sports gambling, help for sports betting, if you're not coming at it with a lens of treatment, it's basically, how do I gamble? How do I find a place to get it? How do I get my app to work? So just Googling help for sports betting doesn't mean help for addiction to sports betting. It's how to bet on sports. And I think that's important for us to try and change the narrative of that. These are our treatment principles with our gamblers, our sports who gamble on sports. Very similar in that we focus on the domains of recovery we want them to focus on: home, health, purpose, and community. And when we use that as a roadmap for recovery, it does seem to work very well with our sports gamblers, just as well as it does for our slot machine players or our poker players. And there are some differences and nuances, but those are the main core principles of recovery I think it's essential to continue to focus on. Specific treatment ideas, though, for sports bettors and sports gamblers. Number one, there are digital tools. So if you're a clinician or if you're a peer recovery specialist, know that we have digital tools that block the client from getting on a regulated or unregulated sports gambling site. Gamban is the one that we use. They download that software. They then can't access the website where they gamble on, so it prevents them from gambling. It then uses that as a gateway for them to then start doing recovery tools. Number two, Gamblers for Recovery is online 24 hours, 7 days a week, 12-step support groups. So for a lot of our folks who are hesitant to go to GA, I say to them, well, why don't you log on and join a couple Zoom groups that are specific for sports gambling in recovery and see if you can get some connection that way. So that's another digital tool. We don't have as well mapped out sports self-exclusion. So imagine if you have mobile sports betting apps, there are some self-exclusion, but we need to develop them better so that men and women who are signing up for those apps can actually then not be participating in them. But one of the things I think we need to focus on more of for providers is working with our clients to reduce access to online funding. So these are the online payday loans, the online predatory lending, online places where people can get money quick without going through a traditional bank. I think that's important, but many of us providers don't realize how easy it is to get a $500 or $1,000 loan very quickly funded by an online bank or an online lending agency, funded directly into your bank account or into your PayPal or into your Venmo account very quickly. And that should be a focus for us in treatment to reduce access to those online loans. And again, working with our clients who are living in a world surrounded by sports gambling information, whether it's on their social media feed or on TV or in the newspaper or on the radio. And it merits us talking with our clients to say, what happens when you see these lines? What happens when you hear people talk about bets that they've made on their social media feed? How does that impact you? So that's very important to bring that up in treatment. So my to-do list for men and women who are working in this area, whether you're a clinician, an educator, a prevention specialist, a concerned family member, or you yourself are in recovery, I think these are the things we need to focus on to minimize the harm when it comes to sports betting and sports gambling. Number one, with our clients, again, limiting the amount of sources of money they can get. One of the areas that I'm concerned about that I see is a number of mobile sports betting apps giving people $500 or $1,000 in free play or virtual credit to continue to gamble. That's a large amount of money. I think it's important for us to, as a field, say, where should we take a stand on this? Because these are not really regulated. We don't really have regulations against online or sports betting or casinos giving out maximum amount of free play. I think that's something we want to look at for us to moving forward. And then secondly, we also want to look at a lot of folks who are not only betting on sports, but also using financial tech software like Crypto.com or Webull or Robinhood, and ensure that that isn't being used to either fund the gambling or isn't its own source of gambling in of itself. So that's an important thing that we need to ask our clients for. Number two, I think we need to look at all the responsible gambling messaging that's currently being used by, industry or by public service announcement groups or by nonprofits, and really say, how do we ensure that the proper healthy messages get out there? For instance, I think some of the more proper responsible gambling messaging are that sports gambling is not a reliable way to make consistent money over long periods of time. It's a way to make some money, but if you view it as a job, if you view it as an investment that's safe and much like investing in stocks or bonds, I think that's the wrong messaging. The messaging I like to see that gambling is entertainment, that it is a way to spend money to get more interest and action on a sporting event. But for it to meaningfully, reliably make money for you, just like a job would, I don't think that's a realistic way of viewing sports gambling. I also want us to think about, we see a lot of people talking about bet now, bet heavy. This is a game you can't miss on. You got to get your money down now. And I think that generates desperation and anxiety and urge to gamble. Instead, saying, how do we manage fear of missing out? How do we manage people who do gamble on sports to know that they can't gamble on every single game, that they'll miss out on betting on some gambling lines that they really want. So I think that's a more responsible way of saying you can't gamble all the time, but how do you do it in a way that minimizes that fear of missing out? And lastly, again, this idea that many sports gamblers in treatment that we see who develop gambling disorder feel like they have a special skill in handicapping and predicting game. They think they're better skilled at betting on football versus basketball than the next person. I think really emphasizing that sports handicapping and sports gambling and sports betting, is it really a game of skill, or is it a game of chance, or what is it somewhere in between? I think that's one of the things that we're seeing, is that when I see a lot of sports betting, if you spend time researching it, you're very disciplined and you're looking at a lot of lines, you're doing a lot of work, that is what I would call sports betting with that's more skill based. But if you're just betting on various games and not doing any research, and you're just betting on a random number that's going to come out, that feels more like random chance and gambling that way. So I think that's important for us as messaging to talk about that link between, do you have special skills versus what is the likelihood that this really is much more based on chance. Third, I think as a field, I'd like us to inform state legislators and regulators about what we see either in the clinic or in the community about what sports gambling, sports betting is doing to our local community. That's through emails and letters. And so legislators know, hey, this is what we're seeing because of expansion of sports betting and gambling. I want us to do more with the media to talk about the stories, both negative and positive, when it comes to sports gambling and sports betting. And that's important to have an ongoing discussion out there. And lastly, talk about innovative ways where we can get sports gamblers to get professional help sooner. Billy came into treatment at a relatively early stage of his gambling disorder. Had we waited another 8 months or a year, the damage could and would have been much more severe. So figuring out how we get gamblers like Billy to come in earlier, not because their mom said they want him in, but because they were willing to, because they recognize that maybe I have some signs here that I need to get some help with. Lastly, I'll finish with a thank you for our problem gambling program in California, all our acknowledgments of people that work in our state program in California. And for anyone watching online here through the ECPG website or through YouTube, feel free to contact me with my email here at the UCLA Gambling Studies Program. That's tfong@mednet.ucla.edu. Questions, comments, cases, other things that work well in your state or other things that didn't work well in your state to address sports gambling. That is my website, uclagamblingprogram.org, where we have a lot of resources for gambling disorder housed there. And lastly, my Twitter ID or handle, if you want to call it, in regards to getting me up to the minute information regarding sports, gambling, and all things related to gambling and mental health. So with that, I thank you for your attention online, and I hope to hear from you in the real world when we continue this dialogue about sports gambling and mental health. Thank you so much.